Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Dirks, and on behalf of ACRL in Choice, I'd like to welcome you to today's program, The Evolution of the Study of Literature, which is sponsored by Gale, a Cengage company. Today's discussion is one in a series of sponsored webinars from ACRL in Choice that addresses new ideas, developments, and products of interest to the academic library community. Free to users, these structured 60-minute live presentations provide the opportunity for interactive discussions of important new issues and developments in academic librarianship by librarians, vendors, authors, and other interested stakeholders. Before we get started, I'd like to point out a few features of the webinar software. In the main area of the screen, you should be able to follow along with the presentation materials. Along the right-hand side, you should see a Q&A panel and a chat panel. If you don't, you can click the buttons labeled Chat and Q&A in the upper right corner of the screen to activate the panels. Please use the Q&A panel to submit questions to our speakers. At the end of the presentation, they will take a few minutes to answer your questions, so please do send them in throughout. If you experience any technical issues, please use the chat box to let me know, and I will troubleshoot the issue with you privately. Today, we're using the hashtag ACRL Choice Webinars during the event, so if you have another screen handy, shout out to us. We're at choice_reviews on Twitter. Also note that we are recording today's program, and everyone who registered will receive a follow-up email with a link to the archived version. Our speaker today is Mark Cormier, the Director, Humanities Publishing at Gale, a Cengage company. So I think with that, we are ready to get started. Over to you, Mark.
Great, thanks, Mark. For everyone on the phone, if you do happen to begin tweeting, just remember my two daughters in college are going to probably get those tweets, so try to be kind. Thanks so much for your time today, and thanks, Mark, for the introduction. We're going to be talking about a number of things today that really revolve around the evolution of literary studies, not just the history of it, but more the practical application of literary studies. And we're going to start with a few things that, coming from a Gale standpoint, a publisher standpoint, help us kind of center ourselves around your universe, and it starts with your students, your end users. So we'll be talking about who is studying literature and how they're studying it today. We're also going to talk about key skills employers are looking for in new graduates. As a humanities-based company, we're constantly looking for new ways to push new skills to humanities students in order to prepare them for employment or for their postgraduate work. And then we'll talk about how literary studies can provide that kind of analytical skill and critical thinking level that are the hallmark of a well-rounded education. And that's just what I talked about there, so we'll go past the next slide. So I think it's important to acknowledge there's a shared mission from Gale. We've been publishing for many years now, as you probably know. And all of this has really come to the fore with critical thinking, and it's oftentimes abused, often overlooked in actual teaching, but it's the perennial front runner for on-demand skills in the workforce. And we're constantly looking for ways to support critical thinking on campus, but our content and delivery platforms are only as good as your ability and students' and faculty's ability to make use of its richness, its ease of use, and the overall value to teaching and learning. So let's focus on who, and this is going to be commonly known to you, but it's important to kind of identify for you the folks that we focus on the most when we think about creating and supporting literary focused content for use in the classroom. So even though our support of English and language arts start at the middle school level, where my team sits with academic product management within the literature program at Gale, we view today's high school seniors as an extension of the collegiate experience as far as learning is concerned. And with the prevalence of AP classes, the lines between today's high school seniors and tomorrow's college freshmen are often blurred. And they continue to be blurred. Even some of the basic tasks like nailing that killer topic for your paper will follow a senior in AP language arts and English right into their freshman and seminar courses. So we hear about the difficulties faculty face with incoming classes that often lack the research and analytical skills they need as freshmen, and that's certainly in our purview to help solve. So moving through the undergraduate experience, the lenses through which students view and understand literature changes along the way. Feminist criticism, Marxist criticism, literary theory, they're all in place to provide access to a different way of looking at a text and providing viewpoints and criteria for reading that are going to be new to students at this level. This is the initial exposure to literary theory. Moving through to the upper level undergraduate students, if a student hasn't just put off their literature studies to this late in the undergrad years, they're probably pursuing a degree in the humanities. Project work at this level can also include text analysis or some kind of natural language processing, which frankly bodes well for graduates that need analysis experience, data analysis experience, so they can leverage that skill at a broad range in a professional setting. And then finally, at the graduate student level, this is where a lot of that digital humanities project work happens. Many of the students at advanced levels are more closely analyzing and citing primary source texts for close reading or use in a text mining capacity. So at this level, much of the focus is on the senior thesis or preparing for postgraduate studies or, frankly, getting ready to begin applying for jobs post-graduation. So it helps ground Gail in terms of who your customers are in the library, your students, both the incoming freshmen that are getting their first year experience courses in many cases, all the way through students that are graduating and looking at continuing their academic education or looking to enter the workforce. So when we talk about the how, we're really focusing on four major things from a publishing standpoint. It begins with comparative literature. It goes into understanding complex texts, then to critical thinking, and then finally classic versus contemporary, and the difference in pedagogy between teaching the two. But it's important to understand and really focus on evaluating a complex text. So much of literary studies is grounded in comparison, as we know, but comparing texts like the construction, the original context, the historicity, and other factors help us define a framework for understanding where and how a title fits in the canon. Understanding why the components of a complex text is important, especially as it relates to defining why those things are complex. So it's just another example of where comparative literature helps provide those differences that enable us to classify documents or texts in their category of complexity. The demands of complex texts are numerous. There's really four that we focus on when we're commissioning scholars to write our content, as well as developers that are including instructional design and how we create our interfaces. But the preparation and construction of complex texts can mean that they're often lengthy and opaque. The way students digest small bite-sized pieces of text today runs contrary to the need to stop and think about a particular phrase or a concept. On that same note, and speaking from experience with two currently enrolled college students and another one on the way, students need to avert their eyes from the devices and all forms of gadgetry that keep them from reading and comprehension. So for many students today, the perceived advantages of multitasking are often quite the opposite. They result more in a lot of bases covered, but less understanding gained in the process. And frankly, that holds true in an office setting too, as everyone in the room here can attest. The other two things focusing on mastering complex texts focus on the difference between analyzing a chapter from a book versus the entire book itself to gain that complexity that is represented throughout the entire book. But complex texts require thought. They require you to slow down. The habit of slow reading, it's not yet gone the way of penmanship, thank goodness, and the ability to slow down and give space to reading can give students access to that nuance and understanding of text that might otherwise be lost if you're reading and you're quote-unquote researching with the device at the same time. It really does mean, and per the ASCD as well, giving that space to close read is an important part to really understanding the context, both social, critical, and otherwise, in which the title is written. All right. So where does this leave critical thinking? Well, outside of understanding complex texts, what's widely regarded as promoted as the outcome of time spent in academic inquiry is critical thinking. So employers and academics and Gail, we all extol the virtues of critical thinking, and yet some folks have trouble describing exactly what it is. It's not unlike digital humanities in that sense, where there's many definitions, but in this case, for critical thinking, most agree it's akin to analytical thinking and the ability to synthesize critical inputs to form an opinion or a position. But it also requires students to question sources. And in the era of fake news, this is one skill applied in literature that can serve students for a lifetime. And in the case of Stony Brook in 2013, they actually created a course that focuses on using your analytical skills to objectify and to analyze sources like you would if you were a journalist. I think that's a fine skill to have. So in the sense of critical thinking, what does it mean to think critically, and what does it take to think critically? And there are varying degrees of policy around how critical thinking can begin. You have to have enough information to think critically. It doesn't pop out of pages of a single text. Arguably, the more information one has, the greater the chance they can synthesize that information into a well-rounded and defensible position that they can articulate and then own themselves. Some courses focus on teaching those chapters that include key concepts or constructs that faculty want to teach. More often than not, the desire to teach the entire text wins out. The development of the characters, the cultural context, all these things are important for a reader to grasp and to understand the message an author is trying to convey through the narrative. And Henry James, I think, said it best. It takes a great deal of history to produce a little bit of literature, and I think that makes sense for critical thinking as well. Another area of I wouldn't say conflict, but differing schools of thought comes from the analysis of the classic versus contemporary. Of course, we've all been through survey courses that will treat the 18th century, the 19th century, or world literature in a survey format, so you get the breadth and the depth as much as you can in a 14-week course. Oftentimes, the more contemporary authors, if you're teaching this through a timeline, will get lost and will be packed into the last few weeks of class. So the old versus new, or the canon versus contemporary, exists as a conflict in many cases. I personally love the good history of literature course, but if literature isn't a part of a student's professional development, then engaging and perhaps contemporarily relevant texts are a good way to keep the engagement higher. Further to that, if we think about where texts are today, they came from somewhere. Classic literature endures, and it endures because it's really a record of our history, our shared history, and cultural change and cultural nuance, and how we communicate things that happened in the past for us to digest here in the future. Also, a lot of the themes that are popular today are steeped and based in titles that predate us by hundreds of years. They began somewhere. So looking back thematically, a student can find an embarrassment of riches of titles that relate specifically to a title that bears the same kind of thematic treatment that they have today in contemporary works. So let's talk about what this means for graduates and what they can learn through critical thinking, analytical thinking, applying themselves through close reading and greater analysis. So no matter where you go today, critical thinking, comparative literature, historical and cultural context, all these lead to somewhere, and for most graduates, it's to the jobs board. And each of the skills on this page from Monster this year, they're human skills, even the ones that focus on technology and media, since the willingness to learn is really the only thing that stands between a student and these skills. 90% of the reports like this say essentially the same thing in terms of what employers are looking for. Some of these skills are more likely needed in a corporate environment, but whether you're analyzing the entire Hemingway corpus with a network analysis tool, or you're managing logistics for a rental car company, data analysis covers both scenarios. That's a good way to focus what you're learning today in literature, especially at the higher undergraduate level classes, to apply perhaps in an office when you graduate. But a lot of the things that Monster is focusing on here, again, 90% of these you will find across the board with job boards, job posting sites, placement positions or placement services, etc. In this case, there's 5 very similar things that show up for the balance. And I won't go too much into this, but you can see the critical thinking and data analysis are going to be the 2 most prevalent across all of the requested or desired skills, not just in corporate America, but across the board. And often, a lot of times, placement services will cite the same kind of statistics and the same kind of skill sets as employers are looking to leverage from recent graduates. Going a bit further, Bloomberg does a nice way of visualizing this. So they publish an annual study that aligns key skill sets to a list of industries that are represented by over 100 hiring companies across the entire spectrum of these industries. Students of your lit survey courses may not go on to become historians, academics, or playwrights, but they have a chance in that relatively short amount of time to analyze and synthesize complex texts cultural nuance, and then form and defend their own positions. These are critical skills that employers agree have a central role in the workforce as well. So analytical skills, also known as critical thinking, are high on the list of desired skills in the workforce today. The good news is they're available for hire. So apparently, employers are finding that students are coming equipped with some degree of analytical thinking. They're not necessarily the hardest things to nail down with new candidates. I don't know if we can thank comparative literature for all that, but it certainly contributes to new graduates' ability to think and perform analytically. The relationship between working collaboratively and possessing leadership skills is, I think, directly related to this transition from a lot of vertical silos in the corporate space to a more team-based ethic that you probably are seeing in your libraries today. So if you look at the less common, more desired skills, strategic thinking and leadership are very important. The more common, more desired skills like analytical thinking and working collaboratively, to my mind, speak directly to a lot of what you see in libraries today. You have agile workspaces with community groups coming in to research things in a collaborative setting. You have team projects. Some of that may include data analysis. Some of it may include close reading. But that idea of collaborating is going to need leadership in the corporate environment where you have a lot of very small teams now focusing on finite tasks, all to meet one particular goal. And this actually hasn't changed that much. So in 2018, you see a viewpoint. 2017 looks nearly identical. So there's not much of a change in trend, even in the last 10 years. I think that analytical thinking has risen a bit more, but you see a lot of the same kind of statistics, not just from Bloomberg, but across the board. So in our job to help support critical thinking and 21st century skills, what do we do then? How is this informing what we do at Gale? Well, it really focuses on four main things that we try to do in the creation of content and the creation of tools that deliver that content. The first thing we do from an editorial standpoint is support multiple viewpoints. It doesn't mean that we're looking for neutral viewpoints. We're really looking for particular viewpoints that are opposing in many cases. That's a specialty that Gale has through opposing viewpoints. But it sheds light on varying schools of thought, and it better informs students to create their own personal opinions and positions along the way. Those of you that know Gale fairly well will understand that context is critical for us. We're looking to describe and to illuminate cultural sensibilities, the world events, advancements in the arts, all these things that impact an author's work, their position, and what they're trying to convey in a text. The way that culture responds to literary works changes over time as well, and it tells us a great deal about our past and where we're going as a society. So we try to illuminate things on a chronological basis to see and to illuminate for students how things change over time. It gives them a sense of how we got to where we're at today and how we respond to particular titles. And then we're also including a number of analysis tools for research, graphical tools, term frequency tools, things that bring a visual representation of a search or the research time that they're spending within our products. So supporting multiple viewpoints is important. We do that in a number of our products in the literary line. In this case, this is a page from Literature Criticism Online. This is an interesting one in that it's about Lincoln. It's about his writing, not just the Gettysburg Address and his contributions to the Emancipation Proclamation. But in this case, it's focusing on the Emancipation Proclamation. Ralph Waldo Emerson, an ardent abolitionist, had a particular point of view that it was worth the price in blood that we paid. 1863, a year later, less than a year later, the Times of London editorial board responded with a scathing criticism of the Civil War, and it cast doubt on the actual outcomes for the freed black slaves in the Emancipation Proclamation. So it really, it begs us to think about not only what was the intent of the editorial board in the Times of London and who was controlling that board, but taking a look at the context in which they're writing it. The implications of the conversation on this page alone, they're economic, they're social, they're cultural, they're certainly racial, they're also geographic and geopolitical. So managing and synthesizing these multiple viewpoints here and across our series, it's part of the process of decision making. It's a timeless skill for graduates to embrace, whether they're going to continue in their scholarly pursuits or enter the workforce. In the case of canonical works, in this case, the brothers Karamazov, A cultural feedback loop would not be complete without voices from authors that were contemporary to the original work, or authors or critics that were influenced by the literature and it's represented in their own writing. This helps kind of bring the themes and cultural context of the works into a more contemporary spotlight, and it enables students to clearly recognize how works are interpreted in the present day and how that changes over time. In this case, a lot of the discourse on the brothers Karamazov was philosophical, as you can see by the contributors here. So it's important to us not only to represent journal content, but also book content, personal essays, diary entries, and lectures like this one from Nabokov along the way, just to enrich the context in which a student can read or learn about a title. Cultural context, context. It's one of our fortes. It's one of the things that we focus on the most. And unfortunately, the animation is not going to work in this slide, but I can certainly walk through it. This is a very brief study on a project that was done by a number of our interns that were doing usability testing at the University of Michigan for our Gale Literary Sources platform. In order to understand a given work, you need to understand the origins as well as the context for where the title fits in a larger narrative. In this case, we're looking at imperialism as a topic in our Gale Literary Sources platform. And while on the left side you can see the results are robust, there's a lot of content and a lot of information related specific to imperialism, but also related topics. Even with the great relevance algorithms that are employed today, there's a lot of content here, probably too much for a student to synthesize and certainly way too much to read through. Because of the indexing work that happens on the back end, we're able to not only refine the results to a manageable number, but we're able to make deeper connections between documents. And in this case, on the right-hand side, we've clicked on one of the subject limiters that shows African literature, and it's revealed a much more manageable and a much more direct and focused result set. And in the middle, you can see the subject guide has resulted to that more focused area of study. So it not only touches on African literature, also major authors and emerging authors that speak to diaspora and imperialism in the African subcontinent, but also works that are related to imperialism, themes, other titles and works as well. So it's this way where, and unfortunately you can't see the graph behind, but what we try to illuminate in our software is related concepts. So even by looking at one visual, in this case imperialism, you can see various kinds of imperialism, various authors that wrote on imperialism and titles that focus on that theme. It helps a student to understand not only have I found information about imperialism, but there's a lot of information related to it that I might not have thought about, and that might actually drive interest in creating a topic for a paper. And we call it Topic Finder because traditionally we find that's one of the hardest things that students have, and that is to create a topic, one that's going to be engaging and potentially differentiate their paper from others. Unexpected voices of the past have a place as well. So we've talked about cultural context. We've talked about authors as well, authors and works. And in this case, this is actually a very entertaining entry that focuses not on Eugene Delacroix, but it's focusing on Edgar Allan Poe. And this is a journal entry from Eugene Delacroix, who was a very famous Impressionist painter at the start of the French Impressionist movement. Here he's speaking about the works of Edgar Allan Poe as they were translated by Baudelaire, and that it simply was not for the French because, frankly, they were above extra-human or supernatural writing. But perhaps the Germans would be entertained by this work. So it's a bit of interesting context that tells you how things are received overseas, but also from a completely different branch of the arts. Complex texts, however, are often regarded as complex through the concepts that they discuss. So for students studying religious literature philosophy, the object isn't necessarily writing style or grammar or even plot, but it's about the belief systems or the mental acuity needed to master conversations, in this case about the existence of God. It's fertile ground for analyzing complex systems and structures that, frankly, are going to require a bit more thoughtful consideration and close reading, and they're going to demand the reader formulate their own opinions. But it can also be entertaining. So walking away from the complexity of philosophy, primary documents are core to our ability to relate context to a user. In this case, the writer of Madame Bovary is having some dating problems. And so going back into journal entries to understand what relationships were like, what his contact with other authors were like, his critics, etc., it helps frame a conversation about an author to perhaps uncover some of their motivations for writing the way they did, as well as the things that they did. Then finally, we want to show intellectual and cultural response over time. And through our curation activities, we typically focus on showing things chronologically to represent how things change over time. In this case, Beowulf, certainly standard in the canon and world literature. It's showing a degree of response that begins at the very beginning of the criticism and analysis of Beowulf in 1826. It was the first published review and analysis of Beowulf since it came out of private hands. This entry goes all the way through media adaptations in 2012, CGI films, and derivative works of Beowulf. Of course, we have some very famous authors contributing to this well in the name of Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. These are both lectures that were delivered a couple years apart that talk about the use of Old English or its relationship to Beowulf, as well as how it inspired them to write Lord of the Rings and Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. So again, a lot of great context and a lot of detail around the underlying motivations behind authors. Going back through time is important not just for literature, but for things related to literature. Michelangelo wasn't necessarily known as an author, although he was prolific in his writing as it related to art. He also worked with Giorgio Vasari, the main biographer of his time, to write other biographies. But in this case, we're looking at over 450 years of context, and in this case, it actually talks about Michelangelo's displeasure with the Council of Trent, and as a byproduct, he would very rarely depict saints in his works, including the Sistine Chapel. So again, a lot of great context, and it helps frame the artist or the writer, whoever it may be, in their own history and in our history as well, by seeing how folks respond to him or her over time. And finally, if we talk about themes and going through literature thematically, this is a great entryway for students that aren't necessarily focused on world literature survey courses or particular courses on, say, Marxist or feminist theory. If you're looking at diving into literature thematically, they often become great entry points for students to not only pick the titles of their choice to read, but they're also interesting topics that might bring some interest from students to dive into the literature underneath them. Gale, as you probably know, is developing a number of tools for analysis, whether it be text mining or simply graphically rendering results in ways that make connections visually for students. And we've done that in our platforms over the years. At this point, we have two major or premier visualizations that we use to depict not only the keywords behind the text itself or the search mechanism, but also the results themselves. In this case, we have a term finder or a topic finder, as I've mentioned a little bit earlier on. In this case, I searched for Frankenstein. And what I got on the left-hand side was information about the original work itself, the modern Prometheus, as it was published in 3 parts in newspapers, but also the author, media adaptations, poems, authors, movements, etc., that are related to Frankenstein. And again, this is a great way for a student to be able to key in or perhaps be exposed to different concepts that are related to their term and create potentially new pathways for research. The middle graphic is a variation of that same chart. In this case, I was looking at Iraqi war. And so you see topics like United Nations, particular cities, battles, people, places related to the Iraqi war, and certainly the literature behind it. On the right-hand side, our term frequency graph allows you to create a graph that includes a number of different keywords to see how they compare in their use in publishing over time. In this case, I've used Gothic and Edgar Allan Poe. Of course, Edgar Allan Poe was born in 1809, I believe. I'm trying to remember now, but certainly his writing didn't start until much later, and we see, unfortunately, that most of the writing about Poe happened in 1849 when he died. But you can also see the relationship to the term Gothic being used in our source collections as well. So it's a good way to kind of frame an author using other terms that are related to help understand how they relate to a given author. So let's talk about adapting to student workflows. We have visualization tools. We've created a number of ways of expressing cultural reaction and analysis over time. We've also brought in voices from the past and very famous authors to give their own opinions on a particular work, author, or topic. part of our journey in publishing is to adapt to student workflows. So we know that there's a lot of content out there for students to read. We know their time is valuable. We know there's a lot going on. They are micromanaging and multitasking all at the same time. So one of the things that we've striven to do is not to create our own technologies, but adapt technologies that are available today that are well known to student workflows, educators, and librarians as well. So I'm going to give you a brief walkthrough of some of the technologies that we have in place today across most of our platforms, if not all of them. In this case, this is Gale Literature Resource Center. And just to highlight a few of the tools that are available, not only can you translate content, you can also have it repeated back in an MP3 form, or it can be listened to at your computer. You can choose an Australian, you can choose an Englishman, you can choose any number of different voices to represent that text, and you can download those MP3s as well. We also have a number of citation tools that link out to bibliographic source citation tools, and we also support MLA 7, 8, and APA, and we'll be adding other formats along the way. So there's a number of things we do to make this content extensible. It's not meant to just be interpreted, read, etc. in the session itself. We want to make sure that the time a student or you are spending in the platform can be used and leveraged once that session is done. So we'll take a walkthrough of one key element of that extensibility and how we're adapting to student workflows today, and that's really related to Google Drive and Microsoft OneDrive. So whether you're a Google campus or a Microsoft campus, maybe you're not either yet, but this may inspire you to become one. There's a number of integration tools that we have in place today to help students not only do the research, but also leverage the research outside of our platforms. A lot of it focuses on note-taking, but I'll walk you through right now as an example. In this case, we're looking at Anne Hutchinson and the Antinomian crisis. So we see that we have a number of suggestions. These are related topics. So you may be looking for a particular poem from Anne Hutchinson. You might be looking for a journal entry, etc. Students are given the option to pick one, or just a general search here on Anne Hutchinson. Once results are returned, much like you saw in the earlier version looking at, or the earlier screen looking at imperialism, results are organized very similarly. You get literature criticism, biographies, topic and work overviews, etc. And they're all organized into buckets. So depending on what you're looking for, it's fairly easy to access it. Most of the time we find literature criticism is the first thing students are looking for, which is why that is the first default. Once you've selected a content set or a document, there's a number of things you can do at this point that are fairly new to the platform. One of the things we want to make sure we can support is note-taking. And this is not only highlighting content, but also being able to annotate the content itself to give you the ability to record what you're reading, why you've highlighted particular things, as well as jotting down notes that are relevant to what you're capturing. So in this case, we have 6 or 7 colors that you can highlight content with. Typically, we found through our usage statistics that a lot of folks are using pink, green, and yellow to show neutral, positive, and negative sentiment. So in this case, I've marked up a journal entry to the Antinomian crisis, and I'm using pink for negative connotation, yellow for neutral, green for positive connotation. So these could be about points of view, positions, trials, jury proceedings, etc. So there's some way for me to understand why I've highlighted that content, but also what is the sentiment perhaps in a pro-con debate. So I can click on highlights and notes once I've captured all this information in my text, and then see that in a digest form. So not only do I have the notes, I also, or the highlighted text, I've also included my notes that tell me why I've highlighted this, but I also carry forward the color of the highlighting so I can tell whether or not it's positive, negative, or neutral. So this is interesting and it's valuable, but it happens inside of the platform. Well, what happens if we want to take it outside of our platform? So once you get to this point, you can download each of these note fields, as well as the notes that you've included and the highlighted text, including as well links back to the document in Gale Literary Sources. And I apologize, there was some animation in all this, so it looks a bit cluttered, but Once you have selected download, you can select Google Drive or OneDrive, and you're given a notice that it's in your account. From that point, you can then go out to Google Drive and see the content as your preferences dictate. So you can organize this by icons or folders. You can organize it in list view. But all that content that you used in your session and marked up is available. In fact, the highlighting also carries over to Google Drive. So all of your notes are organized here. All the text that you've saved is there, as well as the colored highlighting. You can save this in list view as well. So those familiar with Google Drive know there's a lot of variation in terms of how the account is set up and what you can do. It's very feature rich, and the features themselves, some of them mirror what we have available in Gale literary sources today, but there's actually even a few more tools along the way in Google Drive and Microsoft OneDrive to help add a bit more clarity around the notes that you've captured as well as the text you've highlighted. Finally, there's a couple of other features related to Google Classroom that allow you to not only create a class and send that link out to the class students, the routing list of students that are actually in the class, so it's limited and relegated just to that student body, but you can also add a number of different content types. And so in this case, we're looking at the art of fiction and the impact of Beowulf on contemporary science fiction. So you can include your own content, you can include content from Gale, but you can also include things like videos. And of course, the YouTube phenomenon as a teaching tool is certainly not lost on me as a father of a high school student and 2 college students. It's a wonderful platform to deliver all kinds of content, good and bad, but this way you can actually curate a list of videos that you want students to see in support of this class in Google Classroom. So I just looked at my watch and I completely ignored my colleagues telling me what the time looked like, and I really raced through those slides. I would like to open it up to questions that you may have based on what we've talked about today in terms of instruction, in terms of the features that we provide through our publishing endeavors, and also through a lot of what employers are looking for today in skill sets. And certainly Gale is looking at those same kind of criteria that a lot of companies are in terms of the quality of the graduates and the skills that they've learned in their undergraduate experience. This slide deck will also be available as other choice slide decks are, so you can look at the webinar and follow along to the slides and the narrative along the way.
Great, and this is Mark from ACRL in Choice, and I will make sure that we get that up on our website as soon as we can. And I would just encourage folks, if you do have questions for our speaker, Mark Cormier, today, to drop them into the Q&A panel, and we will get to those as soon as they come through and as soon as we see them. So to start out, it looks like we've got a couple of questions in the hopper here. The first one, I think, that we've got is, do you see the study of literature, I think this related to something earlier in the presentation, as helping to solve the problem of fake news? How do you think that it does that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it all comes down to understanding sources and verifying and vetting sources. Just like that Sunnybrook course that recently came up, there's a lot of interest in the qualifications behind content and the veracity of the content. Certainly, you want to be able to cite verifiable and known and creditable sources, but it really comes down to making sense of what that is telling you. And I think the skills that you learn from not accepting viewpoints at face value and questioning them, but also looking for an alternate point of view before you decide on what yours is critically important. And so the more vested you are in interpreting sources and actually reading them and understanding them, I think that's going to translate into a better comprehension, not only of the new sources as they exist today, but also taking a look at what it is they're actually saying. That's standard fare, not just for fake news, but for sources in business as well, being able to analyze sources of information, because there's a lot at stake. Certainly for Gale, the sources that we bring in, that we not only aggregate but that we commission, it's important that we understand that, first of all, we're not taking a viewpoint ourselves as a publisher, but we're bringing different viewpoints into the company for the use by students to analyze. And so we do a great deal of vetting of our content, not only the content we create, but also the content that we distribute on behalf of news agencies, periodicals, et cetera. So I think literature is a great way, not only just from the comparative text standpoint, but being able to look at critical analysis over time and looking at the sources and being able to be witness to an argument about a particular work or about a particular literary topic and come to your own conclusions about what you read. I do think it's important that there's enough information a student has in order to form a critical opinion. I don't think you can just approach a text and think critically about it without understanding some context, be it the context in which the title is written, but also other texts that are from that period or related in some way. I think it really behooves a student especially to get as many of these sources as they can behind their belt in order to form those opinions. Oftentimes that might not be the case when you're teaching to a test, and certainly in the AP environment where there's a directed outcome. So I think in that case, especially with the change in AP guidelines in literature over the past couple of years, teachers are really challenged to be able to not only teach to a test, but bring some level of critical analysis into the curriculum.
Excellent, excellent. We have another question here from, let me see, it looks like Susan, who is sort of discussing the highlighting capabilities that you were talking about a little bit earlier. And she says, regarding highlighting, I found an article and selected a line of text, so it sounds like she's in the product itself. But when I select highlights and notes, I get this message. There are no highlights to display. Select any article text to add highlights and notes. Do you have any further direction for Susan, or any additional thoughts on that?
I have not seen that before, but it might be something around workflow. Typically, even for a Luddite like myself, I made sense of it pretty quickly, but there could be a couple of things that I could explore, and my colleague is giving me some information. Oh, okay. Susan, thank you. You solved it yourself. That's kind of answer. I appreciate that.
Yep. It looks like she's been able to figure it out, which is great. And I would just encourage folks, if you have other questions or other comments, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A and we'll get to those. We have a question here about critical thinking and how do you see literature or the study of literature impacting critical thinking skill development?
I think it's solely based on pulling together opposing opinions or opinions that you're not aware of. So if you digest the text yourself without some kind of context in terms of its reception, and that's pretty typical in the high school arena. You're given a text to read, and you need to form your own opinions, including your own personal narratives in response to that. And that's all fine, and we've all been through that experience. And we've learned a lot through that experience because it really does force you to think specifically about that work versus any other related works. But when it comes down to critical skill or critical thinking development, I think it is the comparative piece that allows a student to form their own opinion based on the opinions of others. You may come in with very strong opinions about a particular work. Maybe you're more politically or socially aligned to a text, and so you come in with some preconceived ideas or notions. But being able to look at varying responses and other opinions will either, one, confuse you because you can't choose, but it may support your opinion and solidify it, or it may make you change your mind about some of those preconceived notions.
Excellent. And we've got another question here that came through from James, who has a quote here for us, and I think it's sort of a meaty question that he's going after. That he says, the former librarian, or he says James Billington, Steve says, James Billington, the former Librarian of Congress, said that digitization is, quote, threatening the cultural values. It's shortening the attention span. It's destroying the English language. And Steve is wondering, could you respond to this?
I think as a father of three, I see a lot of devices in my house. I am a self-proclaimed Luddite because I love close reading in paperbacks, but I'm also directing the Digital Humanities program at Gale, so there's a fine balance I have to take. I think a lot of this comes down to maintaining a balance between close and distant reading. Data analytics are not going to solve everything for you. They're not going to give you the nuance you read or that you gain by reading all of Brothers Karamazov versus data analyzing all of Dostoevsky's work. Those are two different areas and levels of research. So our position, certainly as a publisher, is to promote close reading and to promote contextual and critical analysis. That is what we stand by as a company. In the case of digital technologies, I think these things are interesting. If you take a look at digital scholarship today and using more quantitative data versus the actual works themselves, there are many things that we can learn that are not visible in the close reading because we don't have the massive content to compare it to and to analyze, but it's also described differently when you're using indexing and metadata to show a visualization versus reading an actual work and being able to make your own opinions about it. They are two different spheres of influence and research entirely. Gail's position is we need to support both because there is a growing need to not only leverage data analytics skills, but also to support the things that we're learning through data science. Our position, and mine personally, is that I regret the day that penmanship went away. That's how old-fashioned I am. I do think there's incredibly an immense value in a student engaging in a wide variety of works from a broad range of time to steep themselves in their own personal history. So my personal opinion is that you're never going to get away from the text itself. The digital technologies that are available today, I can't read something on my iPad, frankly. My children can. They have that capacity, I think, as digital natives to look at an iPad and not feel like it's going to lessen the experience. Not that I abhor an iPad, but I always go back to the actual text themselves. So I think students have a capacity that, frankly, you know, a lot of us that grew up in a more traditional sense, we haven't quite internalized. The one-on-one programs where laptops are available all the time, I think that's wonderful from a sharing capacity and everyone is on the same page in terms of the resource they have to study. But I don't think that shortcuts, I think there's efficiencies you can gain from digital technologies. I don't believe in shortcuts. If anything, I think the ability to highlight and annotate and do the things that I showed you in the platform, those are useful because they're extensible, and I think that's a good use of digital technology because we're meeting students where they're already at. So as opposed to us making a whole nother account that you have to remember credentials for and probably not even doing it as well as Google Drive, we're leveraging a technology that exists already, and I think that's a fine thing. The one thing I do think as well relating to digital technology, the YouTube phenomenon is far and away one of the most interesting dynamics I've seen, not only in the high school arena, but also in the collegiate environment. I certainly see a lot more use of video, and not that that's a bad thing, but I don't think you can get away from the written word if you're going to understand a derivative work or a media adaptation. So it's really a very long-winded way of saying I'm divided on both. I support both, but I think there's certainly a place and a time where students need to engage in original text and even primary documents to really understand the nuance and the importance of the original work itself.
All right, yeah, that's very interesting.
And I do agree. I just say as well, in reading the note about James Billington, I do think the Twitter environment today, the attention span is quite small. It's much smaller than I remember having to wait for a phone call on the one phone in our house. Now there's a lot of instant gratification. Things come by very, very quickly. And I think that is also impacting people's ability to not think critically about a lot of things, even their own communication. There's a lot of instantaneous reaction, which I think unless you know how to manage it, could be a very dangerous thing.
Certainly, certainly. We've got a few other questions that have come through as well that I'd like to get to. We've got, let me see, one here from Stephanie, and Stephanie asks, have there been discussions of aligning the use of your product with the ACRL framework or other competencies or previous competencies? Yep,
absolutely. So we're at sessions continually, whether it's at ALA, the separate ACRL meetings, and certainly ACRL next year. We have separate publishing groups that are looking at the different guidelines within the ACRL framework, certainly from a pedagogical standpoint. Our instructional design staff are very interested in the framework itself. Even our ebook developers look at the framework. The adoptions between of the framework across each of those, I couldn't quantify for you right now, but it's certainly high on the list of things that we use as guiding principles in creating content, but also the instructional design piece as well. So we look at the ACRL framework as not only helping guide and determine what we publish, but how we publish it as well. The delivery is becoming that much more important than the content itself. So while we have many biographies of Edgar Allan Poe, I don't think anyone's asking for another one. What they want to do is find that information in a way that suits pedagogy and suits student outcomes.
Great, great. We've got another question here, or really a comment from Stephanie, who sort of simply says, and I think you could maybe put, could you talk about this, the importance of studying classics, including literature, philosophy, logic, those sorts of things that maybe aren't as frequently discussed within the contemporary curriculum.
Yeah, I think that's really where critical thinking is at its finest, because you have to make some very subjective opinions about some very weighty topics, whether it's the entomological argument, the existence of God, or even Marxist and feminist theory. So these, topics and theories and philosophy related to literature, I think are far more challenging. They become complex unto themselves, not just the text themselves, but the constructs and the concepts within them. From a classical education myself, I found great value in debate and in logic. It helps you think through things, and logic you can extend into things like analytical thinking and critical thinking. I think logic was, if I could have gone to logic class back in 1985 when I graduated from high school, it might have been called a critical thinking class. But I think it's not necessarily a lost art, but it's certainly something that, like the first year experience classes, I think should be part and parcel to an academic experience.
Absolutely, and as somebody who really enjoyed symbolic logic in college himself, I think that makes perfect sense to me. We have a few more questions here, and one I think that that I'd like to get to is, so why is the study of literature and analysis and the literary analysis important to STEM students?
Yep. Well, I think it comes down to the skill set, and it comes down to analysis. You're going to be, you think the same way at a very human-based level. Analytical skills and critical thinking, they're human skills. They're not necessarily technical skills. So comparing and contrasting viewpoints, understanding things, how they change over time, those are all skills you can bring to a STEM environment. My daughter, being one of them, was going to be the next great Beat Generation poet. And when I told her I would not fund that kind of an education, she went into molecular biology. But she is constantly drawing on the things she learned in her AP literature class in terms of comparing and contrasting and having to form thesis statements and opinions about particular works. So whether you're going into more of a data analytics kind of situation, there are certainly tools and technologies that are being used to analyze text mathematically, meta-analysis, and DH practitioning that will certainly help students that are interested in STEM along the way. But for those students that are going to be engineers, they're going to be in that STEM environment, and they know that from the very beginning. It is the analytical skills and the ability to grade, refute, or accept sources that I think helps you think analytically about not just literature, but it's a behavioral thing. So whether, again, it's data mining the entire corpus of Hemingway's works, or analyzing profits or fleet sales, all these things require analysis. And so I think that skill, it's a very human skill. And in the end, when you graduate, you're a human being working either in the STEM field or the arts or humanities. And so it's going to benefit you, perhaps not equally, because the requirements are going to be different depending on what the job is, but thinking analytically and judging sources and forming your own opinions is a skill that benefits both areas. Soft skills, vocabulary skills, reasoning, those are critical things that come out of comparative literature, and even at the survey course where you have to understand and determine your own opinions along the way. So I think reasoning and logic are certainly two things that could come out of a very well-rounded liberal arts education.
Absolutely, absolutely. So we have another question here that, let me see, asks, this librarian says, I don't have the literature collection, but they're thinking about maybe looking at it. Where or what would you recommend that this person starts with?
That's a loaded question. It depends on the curriculum. You know, we go from all time periods. We focus on particular genres. The Literature Resource Center is probably the largest and the best kind of entry level, as well as more advanced tool to use for general studies. We call it the fire hose of literary content because it does cover topics, themes, authors, works, etc. We call it everything about an author and his or her works, including the context in which it was written. So Literature Resource Center is a great place to start. The Literature Criticism Series is the one that really focuses on representing viewpoints and analysis over time, including famous authors, etc. So I think it really depends on what the purpose is. You could get in touch with anyone at Gale to talk more about understanding what your needs are in the curriculum. We'd rather have that conversation than to prescribe something off the bat. I think it really would help us tailor something specifically to your needs.
That makes sense. Yeah, absolutely. We've got another question here from Morella, who asks or says, please comment on Gale accessing users' Google Drive and use of their personal info as per this, quote, by clicking allow, you allow this app to use your information in accordance to their terms of service and privacy policies. Could you talk about what that means, maybe, and what information the Gale products are accessing through the Google Drive and that sort of thing?
Yeah, Google Drive is basically an authentication form. So it's a pathway into a place where students are already doing their work. The only thing that we have are credentials. We don't have any personal information on our side. So, and frankly, we don't want that information. So there is no personal information recorded with Gale. We simply have the sign-on information to allow access to our content being, or the students' content that they've made and collected and saved during their session to be loaded to their Google Drive account. So we're not actually allowed to see any of that. We don't want to see any of that, and that's part of our terms of agreement with Google. And it's the same with Microsoft as well. So there's no passing of personal information. It's all credential-based.
Great. That makes a lot of sense. And I think that, yeah, that may allay some folks' fears about sharing that sort of information. Absolutely. Well, we're just about at the end of our time today, so I'll take a moment here to say thank you very much, Mark, for spending time with us today and for walking us through all of this information. It's been very interesting, so thank you.
Thanks,
and I would also just offer a quick reminder to everybody out there listening in today. We did record today's program, so be on the lookout for a follow-up email from ACRL and Choice with a link to that recording. I'd also mention that you should see a link to our brief 5-question survey in the chat box. If you could please take a minute to fill that out and let us know how we did, we would really appreciate it. So thanks again to everyone out there for joining us today. I hope that you enjoyed this session, and I hope that you have an excellent rest of your day.